83-year-old Margaret Ellis never imagined that a simple lunch at a quiet roadside diner would end with her own son telling her she didn't belong in the family anymore. But what neither he nor anyone else in that room realized was that a biker sitting just a few feet away had heard every single word, and he was about to do something that would change all of their lives forever. The diner sat just off a dusty highway outside a small American town, the kind of place where the bell above the door chimed softly every time someone walked in, and the smell of coffee clung to the air like a memory that refused to leave. And Margaret had always liked places like this because they reminded her of simpler times, back when her husband was still alive and Sunday breakfasts meant laughter instead of silence. But today felt different from the moment she stepped inside because her son Daniel had insisted on meeting here instead of at home, and he'd sounded distant on the phone, distracted in a way that made her chest feel tight, though she couldn't quite explain why. And as she carefully lowered herself into the booth across from him and his wife Carol, she noticed the way neither of them smiled, the way Carol kept tapping her fingers against the table while glancing at her phone, and the way Daniel avoided eye contact as if looking at his own mother had suddenly become difficult. And Margaret, trying to ignore the unease creeping into her thoughts, folded her hands neatly in her lap and offered a gentle smile, asking about their day, about work, about anything that might soften whatever tension had settled between them. But her questions were met with short answers, clipped responses that only made the silence heavier. And when the waitress came by to take their order, Margaret asked for tea while Daniel and Carol said they weren't hungry, which struck her as odd because Daniel had always loved the diner's pancakes, always insisted they were the best in the county, and yet now he sat there stiffly, his shoulders tense, his gaze fixed somewhere past her, as if he were rehearsing something in his mind. And that was when Margaret felt it clearly for the first time, that something was wrong, deeply wrong, and she tried to prepare herself though she didn't know for what, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for her napkin and began folding it over and over just to keep her hands busy, a habit she developed over the years whenever she felt anxious. And finally Daniel cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the quiet like a warning bell, and he leaned forward just enough to signal that whatever he was about to say mattered. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice lacking the warmth it once carried. And Margaret nodded softly, still holding on to hope that this was something small, something manageable. "Of course, sweetheart," she replied, her tone gentle, patient. But before Daniel could continue, Carol leaned in, her expression firm, almost impatient, as if she'd been waiting for this moment and didn't want it delayed any longer. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her words sharp and direct, and Margaret blinked in confusion, her mind scrambling to understand. "Doing what, dear?" she asked, and Carol let out a small sigh, the kind people use when they believe something should already be obvious. "This," she said, gesturing vaguely between them. "Taking care of you, rearranging our lives, covering your expenses. It's just not working anymore." And the words hit Margaret harder than she expected, not because of their content alone, but because of how easily they were spoken, as if the years she had spent raising Daniel, the sacrifices she had made, the love she had given, had somehow been reduced to an inconvenience. And she felt her chest tighten as she tried to respond. "I didn't realize I was causing so much trouble," she said quietly, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. And Daniel finally spoke again, though he still wouldn't meet her eyes. "It's not just that," he said, pausing briefly as if choosing his words carefully. "It's just, things have changed, and you don't really fit into our life anymore." And for a moment Margaret didn't fully understand what he meant, her mind refusing to accept the implication. But then the meaning settled in, heavy and undeniable, and she looked at him, really looked at him, searching for the boy she had raised, the boy who used to run to her after school, who used to call her when he needed advice, who used to tell her she was the most important person in his life. And she couldn't find him, not in the man sitting across from her now. And her voice came out softer than she intended, almost fragile. "I don't belong," she asked. And there was a brief moment, just a second, where it seemed like Daniel might hesitate, might reconsider. But Carol spoke instead, her tone firm and unyielding. "No, Margaret," she said, dropping the pretense of affection entirely. "You haven't for a long time." And the words seemed to echo in Margaret's mind, repeating over and over as if they were trying to carve themselves into her memory. And suddenly the diner felt colder, quieter, the familiar warmth replaced by something hollow and unfamiliar, and she felt smaller in that moment than she had in years, her shoulders slightly hunched, her hands still clutching the napkin as if it were the only thing grounding her to reality. And she didn't notice at first that the conversation had drawn attention, that a few nearby customers had gone silent, that even the waitress behind the counter had slowed her movements, because all Margaret could focus on was the realization settling deep in her chest that the family she had believed in, the family she had devoted her life to, was now telling her she was no longer part of it. And just a few tables away, a man in a worn leather vest sat with a cup of coffee in his hand, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, and he hadn't meant to listen, hadn't meant to get involved. But the words had carried across the diner whether he wanted them to or not. And as he slowly set his cup down on the table, the faint clink of ceramic against wood barely audible over the silence, something in his expression changed, something that suggested this moment was far from over. The biker hadn't planned on getting involved, but the moment those words, "You don't belong," cut through the diner, something old and buried stirred in his chest, something he'd spent years trying to forget, because Jack Ryder Collins knew exactly what it felt like to be cast aside, like you didn't matter, like you were something people tolerated until it became inconvenient. And as he sat there staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of him, his reflection faint in the dark liquid, he heard echoes of his own past, his own mother sitting at a kitchen table years ago, tired and worn, whispering apologies she never should have had to say. And that memory tightened his jaw now as he glanced over toward Margaret, who sat frozen in that booth like the ground had disappeared beneath her, her hands still clutching that folded napkin as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. And Ryder exhaled slowly, once, steadying himself, because men like him didn't step into strangers' lives lightly, but they also didn't sit by when something wrong unfolded right in front of them. And this was wrong, deeply wrong, the kind of wrong that didn't fix itself with silence. So he pushed his chair back, the scrape of metal against tile loud enough to turn a few heads, and he stood to his full height, broad shoulders stretching the worn leather of his vest, boots heavy as they hit the floor one step at a time. And with each step toward that booth, the quiet tension in the diner grew thicker, conversations dying out mid-sentence, forks pausing halfway to mouths, because people could feel it, that something was about to happen. And Daniel noticed him first, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion as Ryder approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone edged with defensiveness. But Ryder didn't answer him, not yet, because his focus wasn't on the man who had just abandoned his own mother. It was on the woman sitting beside him, the woman trying so hard not to break in public. And when Ryder reached the table, he stopped just long enough to soften his voice, to make sure the first words he spoke weren't sharp but steady. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you mind if I sit for a minute?" And Margaret looked up at him, surprised, her eyes searching his face for something. Kindness, maybe, or safety. And whatever she saw there was enough for her to nod faintly. And without waiting for permission from anyone else, Ryder slid into the booth beside her, the leather creaking softly as he settled in. And Carol immediately stiffened, her annoyance flaring into something sharper. "Excuse me, this is a private conversation," she said, her voice tight. But Ryder turned his head just slightly, not even fully looking at her, and said calmly, "It stopped being private the moment you decided to say something like that out loud." And the words landed heavier than their volume suggested, drawing a sharp breath from someone at the counter, and Daniel leaned forward, clearly irritated now. "Look, man, this isn't your business," he said. But Ryder finally met his gaze then, and there was something in his eyes that made Daniel hesitate, not anger exactly, but a quiet certainty that didn't need to raise its voice to be taken seriously. "You're right," Ryder said, nodding once. "It wasn't." He paused just long enough for the weight of that statement to settle. "Until you told your own mother she doesn't belong." And that silence that followed felt different from the one before, heavier, charged, like the air right before a storm breaks. And Margaret sat there between them, her breathing shallow, her eyes darting slightly, as if unsure what was happening or what she was supposed to do, because no one had ever stepped in for her like this before. Not like this. Not in a moment where she felt so completely alone, and Ryder shifted slightly, angling himself toward her, lowering his voice again so it carried warmth instead of confrontation. "You okay?" he asked quietly, and Margaret hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said, and something about that, about her apologizing in a moment where she had been hurt, made Ryder's jaw tighten again, because he had seen that before too. People who had been made to feel like their existence was something they needed to apologize for, and he shook his head slightly. "You didn't," he said firmly. "None of this is on you." And Daniel let out a frustrated breath, running a hand through his hair as if this whole situation had become an inconvenience he hadn't planned for. "Look, we're just trying to handle a family matter," he said, but Ryder didn't let that pass. "Family," he repeated, his tone not mocking but questioning. "Is that what you call it?" And Carol scoffed, clearly losing patience. "We've done more than enough for her," she said. "You don't know what it's been like." And Ryder nodded slowly, acknowledging her words without agreeing with them. "You're right," he said. "I don't know your whole story," he paused, again his voice dropping just enough to draw them in. "But I know this. There's a way to talk to people, especially the ones who raised you, and that wasn't it." And for a moment, no one spoke, not Daniel, not Carol, not even Margaret, who seemed caught between disbelief and something else, something fragile that looked a lot like hope. And then Ryder leaned back slightly, his gaze returning to Margaret, softening again. "Ma'am," he said, "you got somewhere to go after this." And the question seemed to catch her off guard, as if she hadn't thought that far ahead, as if this conversation had pulled the ground out from under her before she could plan her next step. And slowly, almost reluctantly, she shook her head. "No," she admitted, and that single word carried more weight than anything else said in that diner so far, because it wasn't just about a place to stay. It was about the absence of belonging, the absence of anyone waiting for her. And Ryder nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something he had already decided, and he pushed himself up from the booth, standing tall again. And for a second it looked like he might just walk away, like he had said his piece, and that would be the end of it. But instead he turned back toward Margaret, and did something that made the entire room go still. He extended his hand toward her, steady and certain, and said, "Well, you do now." And Margaret stared at his hand for a moment, her eyes filling despite her efforts to hold it together, because in that simple gesture was something she hadn't felt in a long time. An offer, not of obligation, not of reluctant duty, but of choice. And around them, the diner remained silent, every person there aware that they were witnessing something far bigger than a disagreement at a table. They were watching a moment where one life could change direction entirely. And Daniel shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing too late that whatever control he thought he had over the situation was slipping away, while Carol crossed her arms, her expression unreadable but no longer as confident as before. And Margaret, with trembling fingers, slowly reached out and placed her hand in Ryder's. Margaret's hand trembled in Ryder's for just a moment longer before she gathered what little strength she had left and let him help her stand, her knees unsteady not just from age but from the emotional weight of everything that had just happened. And as she rose from that booth, she didn't look back right away because part of her already knew what she would see. Her son sitting there in silence, avoiding her eyes, choosing distance over the woman who had once been his entire world. And when she finally did glance back, just briefly, it was enough to confirm it. Daniel didn't move, didn't call out, didn't stop her. And that quiet inaction spoke louder than anything he could have said, and somehow that hurt more than the words ever could. But Ryder didn't rush her, didn't pull her forward. He simply stood there beside her, steady and patient, giving her the space to take that final step on her own. And when she did, when she turned away from that table and began walking toward the door with him, something shifted in the room, something subtle but undeniable. Like everyone present understood they were witnessing a line being drawn between what was and what would be. And the bell above the diner door chimed softly as Ryder pushed it open, the warm air inside giving way to the low, distant rumble of engines outside, a sound that grew louder with each step they took until it filled the space around them, deep and powerful. And Margaret paused just outside the doorway, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the sight before her. A row of motorcycles stretching across the parking lot, chrome catching the sunlight, engines idling in a steady rhythm that felt almost alive, and beside them stood a group of men and women in leather vests, their presence commanding but not threatening, their attention already focused on Ryder as if they had been waiting for his signal, and Margaret instinctively hesitated, her grip tightening slightly on his arm. I don't want to cause any trouble," she said softly, her voice carrying that same old habit of apology, and Ryder glanced down at her with a small, reassuring smile. "Ma'am," he said gently, "around here, you're not trouble." And then he added, just a little lighter, "Your company." And that earned a few quiet chuckles from the group as they began to approach, their movements calm, respectful, nothing rushed or overwhelming, and a woman with silver hair braided neatly down her back stepped forward first, her eyes kind but sharp in a way that suggested she missed nothing. "Ryder," she said, giving him a nod before turning her attention to Margaret, and her expression softened almost instantly. "And who's this?" she asked, her tone warm, and Ryder didn't hesitate. "This is Margaret," he said simply. "She needs a place where she belongs." And the words hung there for a second, not heavy like before, but full of something else, something steady and certain, and the woman stepped closer, lowering herself just slightly so she was eye level with Margaret. "Well, Margaret," she said, offering a gentle smile. "Then you found us at the right time." And Margaret blinked, clearly overwhelmed, her gaze shifting from one face to another as if trying to understand how strangers could look at her with more kindness than her own family just had. "I don't have anything to offer," she said quietly, almost apologetically, and one of the men behind them let out a soft laugh, not mocking but genuine. "You've got stories, don't you?" he said, and Margaret looked at him, surprised. "Well, yes," she admitted, and he nodded. "That's more than enough." And there was something about the way he said it, like he truly meant it, that made her chest tighten again. But this time it wasn't from hurt. It was from something unfamiliar, something warmer. And Ryder gave her arm a gentle pat before guiding her a few steps closer to his bike, moving carefully, making sure she felt steady every step of the way, and as they reached it, he adjusted the seat slightly, making space for her. "Ever ridden before?" he asked, glancing back at her, and Margaret shook her head, a small, uncertain smile forming despite everything. "No," she said, and Ryder grinned just a little. "First time for everything." And he helped her up slowly, making sure she was comfortable, showing her where to place her hands, how to sit steady, never rushing, never making her feel like she had to keep up. And once she was settled, she hesitated. Again, her hands hovering awkwardly before finally resting lightly against his sides, unsure but willing. And as the other bikers mounted their own motorcycles, engines roaring to life one by one, the sound filled the air with a kind of energy that felt almost electric. And Margaret felt it too, that strange mix of fear and excitement, of uncertainty and possibility, and she glanced back toward the diner one last time, just for a second, and through the window, she could see Daniel still sitting there, his figure small now, distant, and for the first time since the conversation began, she didn't feel the need to go back, didn't feel the pull of obligation or guilt, because something in her had shifted, something quiet but powerful. And as Ryder's bike rumbled beneath her, she tightened her grip just slightly, not out of fear but out of instinct, grounding herself in the moment. And then they pulled out of the parking lot together, a line of bikes moving as one, the road stretching ahead of them under the open sky, and the wind brushed against Margaret's face, carrying away the heaviness she had walked out with, replacing it with something lighter, something freer, and she realized, somewhere between the roar of the engine and the rhythm of the road, that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't being left behind, she was being taken somewhere. And when they finally arrived at a modest building on the edge of town, a place that looked worn but alive, filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of food drifting through open doors, Margaret was helped down just as carefully as she had been helped up, and as she stepped inside, she was greeted not with silence or judgment, but with warmth. With voices calling out greetings, with someone already setting a place at a long table, as if they had been expecting her all along, and Ryder gestured her forward. "Welcome," he said simply, and Margaret stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the noise, the life, the unexpected sense of belonging wrapping around her like something she had almost forgotten existed. And as she slowly made her way to that table, guided by people who treated her like she mattered without needing a reason, she realized something that settled deep in her heart, steady and true. Family wasn't always the people who were supposed to stay. Sometimes it was the people who showed up when others walked away. And as she sat down, a cup of tea placed gently in front of her by someone who hadn't even asked her name twice, Margaret Ellis, 83 years old, finally felt like she belonged again.